Good morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever time of day it happens to be, or night it happens to be for you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome one and all to this C20 event that's entitled Multilateralism in a Time of Transition, the Future of G20 and the UN. My name is Daniel Perel, and I serve as a representative of the Baha'i International Community to the United Nations. And this year, I've also had the pleasure of serving on the International Advisory Committee for the C20. Now, for those who are unaware, the Civil 20, C20, is an independent engagement group of the G20, one of many, and it's a global platform for civil society organizations to engage in the G20 process, delivering their demands and perspectives to world leaders. It's comprised of more than 1,000 civil society organizations from all corners of the world, which have been trying to channel the voice of civil society into the G20 processes since 2013. And this year, of course, has presented a new venue for us to do so. Each year, the C20 convenes voices from CSOs, NGOs, IGOs, all kinds of GOs, global policy experts, G20 senior officials, ministerial representatives from G20 and non-G20 countries. So we try to convene all of these different voices to determine policy solutions required to ensure sustainable and inclusive societies. During this meeting, if you have things that you wish to share publicly out in the wider space, you can use the hashtag C20. And we will begin at the moment. So today, I'm very pleased to have the privilege of facilitating this discussion with 4 phenomenal thinkers and civil society representatives from all over the world. The views which will be shared today have benefited from decades of collective experience, countless conferences, C20s, UN meetings, local, national, regional, and global gatherings, and much more. And following a few framing remarks, we'll turn to the panelists for 2 rounds of contributions, after which we will turn to the questions that I hope you will have raised throughout the engagement gathering. As sometimes stale Zoom meetings have become our lives, I hope that this will feel more like a guided exchange among 5 people with different experiences and an active audience, rather than 5 distinct presentations artificially linked together with some remote people watching. So please try to make this engaging if we can. So in that sense, please feel free to use the chat box to offer remarks and perspectives, add some jokes if you'd like. We can get a pun here and there. We do serious work, but we don't always have to be so serious about it. And this way you can get 2 sessions at the same time. So I will refrain from providing full biographical information of the speakers, as reading their backgrounds could take the full 90 minutes itself. And you're able to find some highlights in the event description, which I'm sure you can find perhaps right below the screen you're looking at. And you can also use this thing called Google, which I think has some biographies, desirable and undesirable, perhaps, that you can find of each of us. So now onto the session. So to provide a little bit of framing for where we find ourselves, amidst the disruption created and in fact accelerated by this world engulfing pandemic, there are numerous possibilities for marked social change. These can bring stability to the world and enrich the lives of its inhabitants if we choose that route. And throughout history, there's these periods of turbulence which present opportunities to redefine collective values and the assumptions that underlie them. So too does this present moment. The range of areas in which established systems and approaches are in need of radical transformation suggest how critical the coming months and years will be in determining the fortunes of humanity. Now, in recent years, reasoned critique of multilateral arrangements have at times been eclipsed by rejection of the very idea of a rules-based international order. Yet this period of pushback is embedded in broader historical processes that carry the global community towards higher degrees of unity. At each stage in human history, more complex levels of integration become not only possible but necessary. And as these more pressing challenges emerge, the body politic is compelled to devise new arrangements that address the needs of the time through greater inclusivity, coherence, and collaboration. The demands of this moment are pushing our existing structures for facilitating deliberation among nations and peoples, as well as these systems of economic cooperation beyond their capacity for effectiveness. And so we find ourselves at the threshold of this defining task. And this ultimately is what we're here to touch upon, and that is purposefully organizing our affairs in full consciousness of ourselves as one people in one shared homeland. So here we are at the C20, which is the civil society voice contributing to a debate among the most powerful policymakers in the world. Essentially, it is our task to be the grassroots voice, the moral voice, the justice voice, speaking to the greatest influencers in an objectively unjust global order. Meanwhile, we have the United Nations, which, though established to promote peace, has expanded its mandate to include development, such as economic progress. And importantly, it's built upon the principle of universal state membership. So with these dual and in some sense competing systems, a neutral observer could rightly question the coherence between these institutions, their legitimacy, and what a reasonable path forward should look like. So in this sense, we'll start the conversation by offering a few questions to our panelists for their consideration. And I'll just read them all. Don't worry, they've heard them before, so it's not like they have to note everything I'm saying. But the first of these questions is, why is cooperation between the UN and the G20 fundamental? How can shared values between them be strengthened? The second is, what are the collective and individual responsibilities of G20 countries towards accelerating the implementation of the SDGs? And what can be done to increase effectiveness of the G20 in addressing SDGs and civic concerns? And what could a better integrated future of G20 and the UN look like? So for this first question, we're going to start with Anselmo, who, like all of you, I've asked to provide just a brief introduction for who he is, so that I don't put words in your mouth. And then we'll turn to Christina, Harsh, and Huri. So Anselmo, you have the floor.
Okay, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to join this panel. I'm speaking from Seoul, South Korea. It is almost 11 o'clock midnight. I've been working on C20 since the beginning, to 2010, when G20 Summit was hosted in South Korea. I was a chair of the so-called civil G20 dialogue. I think the first civil society dialogue with the policymakers within the frame of G20. Since then, I've been engaging the C20, and also last 5 years more on SDG and human rights. These four questions, I think, very timely and also very heavy question, because I can write a thesis, or I can teach about these three topics for one semester. But since I'm the first speaker, I want to give more general, the input, because we have a distinguished expert on specific issues. First, regarding G20 and UN, I said it's very timely because not only the positive sense, also negative sense as well, because when, as you know, G20, when G20 was created, it was 2008. As we all know, it was to address collectively economic financial crisis starting from United States, spreading all over the world. That's why we need the G20. To some extent, they did a good job. They managed to tackle the problem. So it was 12 years ago, but now we have another global crisis, which is COVID-19, So relatively speaking, that time is more united among the 20 countries, but now it's the most divided, as we all know, Especially being in South Korea, we feel really threatened by this global crisis, especially the China-US, the hegemonic, I call it the hegemonic, power, the struggle. And I don't know where we are going to lead, So not only the coronavirus crisis, but also new ways of managing global crisis. In that sense, I think this our discussion is very, very important. And as you know, G20, but your question was shared values. How can shared values between G20? But I need to correct this question. Is there any shared value between two? Maybe shared interest. Shared interest. So economic interest. And then obviously, we believe the UN is representing universal values and also global public goods, but not powerful enough. UN has a legitimacy, because every country participates, they raise their voice, although their voice are not reflected in the policy decisions. But G20, informal, lacking legitimacy, exclusive group, but they are powerful, So how can they bring these two, I think once we succeed in bringing these two for common goals, common value, I think we can really address and also solve the global problems. But unfortunately, that is not the reality now, But since we are also talking about SDG, I want to share briefly with you some background. I spent about 1 hour to do, this is a overall performance of G20 countries about SDG, but it's not by the UN, it's not by G20 itself. It was prepared by SDSN, Jeffrey Sachs Group, Sustainable Development Solution Network. Of course, they have their own indicators. It's not, I cannot say it's 100% objective, but nevertheless, it shows something, interesting. So you see France and Germany and UK, they are top, top 4, in terms of the performance, followed by UK, Japan, South Korea, Canada. So more than half of G20 countries above the average, Of course, some countries like India, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia is below the average, So this is but this is nothing surprising, right? This is what you used to see, The GDP, economic, and the Human Development Index, similar to this one, But now I'm going to show another one, COVID-19, which is very contrasting. So let's look at this COVID-19 statistics. As of today, the average, global average of the number of deaths per million is 134, By every day increasing, every day increasing. So it's not according to total number of deaths, but the number of deaths per million. Do you know which country is the top? Top 4 is San Marino, it's a very small country, and Peru, Belgium, Bolivia. Now Brazil is number 5, and US number 10, UK, Mexico, Italy, France, Argentina. These are top 20, the number of deaths, the leading country in the G20. And then very interestingly, half of them are below average. Germany was the only country in Europe, G20 members, below average. And then most of the Asia Pacific countries like Turkey, India, Indonesia, Australia, Japan, South Korea, China. China is the lowest, very surprisingly, China is the lowest, the 3 per million, followed by South Korea, 8 per million, Okay, these two, Okay, now, what does it mean, these two, So SDG is a 15-year agenda. We have 10 more years to go. And then this COVID-19 is ongoing, it's less than 1 year. How long? We don't know, I think this is a fact. Why such a contrast, What are the policy implications, not only for government and also civil society? What kind of lesson we can learn from COVID-19? But unfortunately, as I said, we are, especially G20 countries, there was a unity in terms of common economic interest. But now, huge divergence, China, US, within even BRICS, China, India, because of border conflict, So it's not only economic, but also security issues. So I think we need to look at whole question once again, because security, economy, and development, I don't want to talk about human rights here now, but these are all interrelated, So I think we need to have a more longer term and also much deeper look into this crisis. Hopefully we can come up with some suggestions. Let me stop here because other speakers will speak more and then I will add my own in the second round. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you so much, Anselmo. Christina, I know you and your colleagues at Stimson have done a lot of work on this relationship between the G20 and the UN, and we would love to hear your thoughts and perspectives on these questions. You have the floor, Christina.
Thank you, Dan, and I'm pleased to share the panel with you, Anselmo, Harsh, Hui, and be part of the C20 Summit. Let me first address the why part of your question. If before the pandemic, we thought that cooperation between the UN and G20 was necessary, now I would say that is essential to, one, ensure that we don't experience another global depression, and two, that we collectively work towards a global recovery plan that is consistent with current global agendas. particularly those promoted by the UN. And of course, we're speaking here about the 2030 agenda in particular. The World Bank, however, predicts that the COVID-19 pandemic is expected to result in a 5.2% contraction in global GDP in 2020. This is the deepest recession in 8 decades, despite unprecedented policy support. And this would be the deepest global recession since World War II, and almost 3 times as steep as the 2009 global recession. At the same time, data from this year's SDG report, for those who had the chance to have a look at it, also paints a not so optimistic picture. Given the socioeconomic impact of the health crisis, we are also either putting the brake on progress or reversing some of the achievements that we have made on the SDGs. COVID has, for instance, marked the first rise in global poverty since 1998, pushing millions of people into extreme poverty and putting even those who were previously secure at risk of poverty and hunger due to loss of incomes, limited social protection, and rising prices. So it is precisely in light of this global health crisis and economic recession that I believe aligning efforts of the G20 and the UN to address global challenges is of particular relevance. And if we want to have an inclusive, resilient, and green recovery, then we definitely need to have G20 members adopt economic and financial policies that are consistent with the 2030 agenda, and that can agree on collective actions that can pave the way for broader systemic changes to a global financial architecture that, for instance, ensures adequate financing for the Sustainable Development Goals. A major impact that it can have also on the global health system is by agreeing on the future vaccines that will be considered, should be considered global public goods to be available and affordable everywhere, supporting global health, global mobility, and global economic recovery. And perhaps the greater responsibility that G20 has in relation to global governance begins with the strengthening of the multilateral institutions whose objective is to make globalization work. It is indeed upon this that much of the G20's legitimacy rests, a legitimacy that stems from what must be its goal of bringing the full weight of its members, 20 of the world's most significant regional and global economies, to support multilateral institutions and their universal membership. Now, in terms of the how of your question, how can cooperation between these two multilateral institutions be strengthened? In the 2015 Albright-Gambari Commission's report on global security, justice, and governance, and the 2019 and 2020 follow-on reports that we produced since then, focusing more on the need for reform during the UN 75th anniversary, we recommended the so-called G20 Plus. This proposal is also listed in the UN 75 Global Governance Forum's outcome document, the roadmap for the future we want, the UN we need, which was presented at the forum right before UNGA week last month. So I'll invite you to check that out as well. What does the proposal entail? We suggest basically the creation of a G20 Plus to accelerate socioeconomic recovery from COVID-19 through enhanced coordination by G20 members with the UN system, Bretton Woods institutions, and related bodies supported by a new small full-time secretariat. Specifically, we argue that the G20, to truly become a premier forum of global economic and financial governance, it needs to upgrade to what we call the G20 Plus. So while the main policy focus of the G20 Plus should remain priority setting on critical issues of the world economy, including economic crisis response, it should establish formal links with relevant intergovernmental organizations for implementation and follow through. And operationally, this proposal would entail assembling the G20 at heads of state level every 2 years at the UN headquarters in New York, time to coincide with the gathering of world leaders at the start of the UN General Assembly in September. Moreover, a modest secretariat should be created for the G20 Plus to give it more institutional presence, as well as to promote greater policy continuity, more accountability, and better integrated economic, social, and environmental approaches to international problems. In April of this year, 25 foreign ministers from the recently formed Alliance for Multilateralism issued a statement arguing, and I quote here, for a cooperative, transparent, science-based and coordinated global response against COVID-19, and to work to minimize disruptions to cross-border trade and global supply chains. Members of the Alliance for Multilateralism that are concurrently also G20 members should be looked to for leadership on the G20 Plus reform proposal, just as Canada's finance minister and later Prime Minister Paul Martin long advocated for the need to upgrade the G20 finance ministers forum to the level of heads of state. And strong support is also expected, of course, from the remaining UN members that are not represented in the current G20. So I'll leave it here. I'll leave this proposal here, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts on it. Thank you, Dan.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. I think that a couple of the proposals you've suggested or outlined are really interesting and worthy of further consideration. I'm curious if either Harsh or Huri have any thoughts on them as they then take the floor, and of course Anselmo when we come back to him later, because they are interesting and certainly would merit, I think, further questioning and discussion. So we'll now pass the floor over to Harsh Jaitly, who's calling from India. So let's hope that he is well connected and wide awake. Harsh, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Wide awake, well connected. I can't say about it, but yes, wide awake, because it's already not that late in India as compared to Anselmo's 11 o'clock in the night. We are still at 7:30 in the evening. See, the interesting thing is that there's a very interesting question. In fact, earlier speaker to me have very well articulated the answers, but I will just add few things into that. One is that, actually we are trying to have two different comparison between two different characteristics, like for example, UN and G20. And the difference is such that whereas in UN, there is a membership of all the countries, and there is also space for civil society. So we have a legitimate space to ask questions, to participate, to raise issues. All countries of the world are represented there. There's a General Assembly. There is a structure which is accountable, which is transparent as far as possible, and some sort of legitimacy also. But on the other hand, if last few years we have seen that the UN system has systematically been weakened. It has become weak now. And they are like, there's a resource crunch, and sometimes people say that UN also operates something like international NGO, because they also raise proposals, they also raise for funding. So there's also a lot of dependency of UN system on others. On the other hand, we are trying to compare it to the G20. G20, as Anselmo said, is not that old, but created for economic crisis, which does not have any accountability, which does not have any permanent structure. As the chairs or the presidency changes, the priority changes. So as a civil society, we have been trying to make sense of this G20 structure, and as a civil society, how we can ask for accountability, how we can, as a rich guy, rather than it becomes like a rich guys club, it becomes a club of people where they can raise genuine questions. So this is I think, going to be a future, very challenging in the future also, because as my earlier speaker said, that in this whole COVID crisis, even in the last few months, if you see, the economy has become upside down. The priorities have become upside down. The changes is such that there is no more discussion on SDGs now. The discussion is now on survival. The discussion is now, say, for even the country like India, who was general, discussion was always that India is emerging, India is becoming this and that. Now the question is whether India is going to survive, how we are going to feed people, how we are going to take care of employment. So the priorities are changing, and we have globally gone on the reverse gear. So I think in the post-COVID, whatever we call it, the new normal when it will come, this is going to be the major challenge in front of all of us, that how we are going to bring that economy on the track along with the social transformation, along with even the democratic structure, because as one of the speakers said, that there is the increase in the conflict among the countries, because maybe there is a, tendency that at the time of crisis, everyone tries to, make their position stronger. So everyone is trying to, like China or India or US or what is happening in Pacific, all those, South China Sea, or all those things which are happening globally. We were reading today that there is a fight erupted in Azerbaijan and all those areas. So how we are going to handle that situation when we are going to come out of it, if whenever it is. The second issue is also that this whole situation, in fact, I will say, I just wanted to add one thing, because since we are talking about C20, the role of C20 becomes more important in future. Why I'm saying so, let's see, this time we are not physically present in Saudi Arabia, but still we are able to speak, we are able to talk to each other, although virtually, whatever format it may be. So there is an increased level of engagement and participation of civil society, irrespective of the state of the economy of the civil society. Earlier, if you see in most of the C20 summits, it was always a challenge for all of us to be at one place, whether it's Australia, whether it's go to Tokyo. We used to negotiate how we are going to go there. But now we are interacting in the cyber world, or e-world, in our opinion, in our conversation. And that thing is also reflected even at the grassroots level in many countries, even in India. So the things are changing. But as you said, why very relevant, our earlier speaker said, but how question is going to be more important, that how we are going to engage as a civil society in making these structures more relevant. We should not let UN lose its shine, and we should not also let even G20 lose its shine, because there is a possibility that new groupings might come out, and what will happen after that. So these are some of the issues I would like to add. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harsh. That was a really valuable contribution, and actually leads right to Huri, who at her perch in New York has actually watched the expansion of online presence throughout the world with a number of fascinating regional networks. So I'm curious, Huri, what is it that you're seeing? What are you hoping for in a relationship, a future relationship between the G20 and the UN? But before giving you the floor, I just want to once again encourage participants to put things in the chat box. It's wonderful to know where you're from, but it'd be more interesting to know what you think. So please be active there, and we are checking. So Huri, go right ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dan, and my fellow speakers. What a rich morning here in New York City to hear all of your passionate contributions, and always fun to have a chat with Dan, where you bring the fun into this heavy work that we sometimes do. And you are right. This invisible virus changed this world in so many ways, right? I mean, with all the organizations, with all the challenges and successes we've had before, let's hope that this virus really does wake everybody up. And as Harsh said, how do we move forward from here is the most important. We know the whys on why we need to do all of this. Most of us do anyway. There's so much, I took so many notes, and I wanted to really make this more conversational, because each of you contributed something that I, hang on to. The most important I want to start by saying is that, let's face it, I mean, as much as UN we think is, does it work? Does it not work? Is it worth it? Of course it is, right? I mean, look at how it has interconnected us to so many different mechanisms as well. And as far as the G20 is concerned, I'm not too familiar with it, I have to be honest. Most of my time is through the UN system and with the Commission on the Status of Women. I am a gender equality activist, advocate, but the G20 governments are also members of the UN. So either G20 comes to the UN or not, we go to G20 through the UN as well, right? I mean, that's the beauty of the UN. Even though they can't mandate, they can't force people to do anything, it is a club of some sort where you can go, and now virtually as well, and hopefully influence governments on how they need to really deliver what their promises are, right? So we love to see governments make promises. Governments love to make promises. They just love to get people to rah-rah behind them and say, look how smart I am, or look how good I am. But how do we make them keep those promises is really something that I would love to dig in deeper and deeper, if possible. I think there was also what Christina said about the upgrade of G20 to UN is where my head was going. Like really, you know, if they don't come to us, we go to them through the UN member states, right? So that was my point there. And then what Anselmo was saying about shared values and shared interests, I think what he came back to say about the common goods is really, to me, what I would like to learn and process more, right? So we don't know if everybody has the same values, right? But we should have some common goals, which we hope is really to take care of our people, to have a peaceful transition into whatever it is that we're doing. But it is really important, like, for example, without security, you know, and I think Harsh mentioned what's going on in Azerbaijan right now with the attacks in the midst of this COVID. It's like, is that the best way to really find development and advancement? I mean, it's really, and how can the world stand by? And we saw that with Myanmar, what they were doing not even a year ago. Like, how can we stand by and watch countries use force when so much of that energy needs to be used to develop and advance humanity and bring health and prosperity and education and the good values that we can hopefully some of us agree with. And I think the only other point I wanted to make is what Dan started the conversation with, that the grassroots, the moral voice of the grassroots civil society, if you want to call it, is very important. We can't disregard that. There's so much we can do from the ground up, right? And I think this technology, the technology we've discovered forcefully through COVID disruption has given us an incredible voice, and I'll address this later on again, but it is so important to realize the power that we can have to make sure that we are purposefully organizing, as Dan said. You know, we need to have a purpose-driven collaboration so that we can achieve. I mean, I'll stop here because I really do want to hear more from each of you in a conversational style as well, because I think the solutions are there. I'm an optimist. No matter what happens, I get drained, I get exhausted, I get depressed as well when I hear about what's going on in this world. But then I wake up in the morning and I go, so what can we do today? How many people can I reach out today? Who can I energize? Who can energize me to bring our voices forward? Like I said, UN is a club of some sort that member states are there. Either we like it or not, for now, that is the only space that 193 countries are accessible. Yes, they're gonna push us out, but we need to keep going in. I mean, I always say, if they close the door, we'll go in from the window. I mean, it's a silly thing to say, but yeah, so, you know, even there has to be ways that we can find to keep engaging with member states to influence them, because I know for a fact we have made a difference in that kind of advocacy. So thanks a lot for this opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Huri, for that. I think, you know, all of you were able to help us transition actually to the next chapter of this conversation, which is another series of questions, and actually a couple more were added by the participants, so I'll just add them to the list of interesting questions. But this is really about the idea of voice and civil society participation. And just again, to take a step back and perhaps frame this dimension of the conversation, last week I had a really interesting conversation with a colleague who works for the UN. And he was saying that this transition in our understanding of how to achieve peace, from it being the result of the appropriate use of force, as Huri was just referencing, to shifting it to being peace as development is actually really quite remarkable in the history of humanity. And the UN, as compared to the League of Nations before it, represents kind of the beginning of this transition. And he went on to say that one could understand democracy as the noblest manifestation of the use of force one could imagine. But it's still not consistent with the ideals of peace as development being the paradigm. So this had me thinking the whole weekend about what we're truly trying to achieve through the democratization of global processes. It seems to me what we're really seeking is this idea of voice, engagement, representation, and above all of this, justice. And so taken in that sense, I want to ask a few questions related to the role of civil society today. And for these questions, we'll reverse the order. So Hudi, you're on notice that you're up first. And Selmo, you get to bat cleanup, as they say in the United States, and try to bring us home. So the questions are, first, and I'll put these in the chat box later. First, how can global governance be democratized? What can be done to promote a people-centered multilateralism? How can we advocate for better civil society representation in international settings? And why are civil society voices vital in an international forum setting? What unique view can we provide to global policymakers? And then a couple questions came up in the chat box that I think maybe you'll be interested in touching upon here as well, which are, how do you think the legitimacy crisis of public opinion towards the G20 and the UN can be faced? And I think this, to me, this is very much directly linked with participation.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Dan? I'm sorry, can you repeat that? That was good.
How do you think the legitimacy crisis of public opinion towards the G20 and the UN can be faced? A second one, and I'll try to read these more slowly. If we are here, it is because we trust in the work of these institutions. But the people, I mean, the billions of people who are not here, may not be in favor of them. So how can we address this? So another question is, what do we do when the most powerful countries in the world decide not to play ball, not to engage, and they dismiss multilateralism and the rule of law as a way to resolve geopolitical problems? So how do we engage when the people we want to engage with may not wish to engage? I mean, that's a very boilerplate way of putting it. Right now we're in a strange moment of turmoil, but who knows the next chapter in turmoil? This needs to be a perennial question. So Hudi, good luck with these questions, and then it's on to others. But the whole idea is to have an open discussion. So Hudi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really wish we can come up with the answers right now in the next 30 minutes, because honestly, the world needs these answers, right? It's mind-boggling. Like I said, I'm an optimist. Unfortunately, today I'm going to need a lot of energy to keep optimistic, because the news out there is harsh, right? And I'm gonna just give a quick example. I really didn't mean to bring this up, but you know, the fact that Azerbaijan came up, you know, these are two countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan. One is like the 10th size of the other one, right? One is large, economy, power, friends in the world, and another one is tiny and is trying to survive. And really, it's like the little engine that could, the children's book that we've read, where it, you know, trying to be human rights centered. We got this velvet revolution that became, that democratized us, right, in this country after the Soviet collapse. And both of these countries have signed the resolution 1325. They both believe in women, peace, and security. And I'm sorry, I'm always going to go with the gender lens. That's who I am. And you know, we've reached out to the women who have been on the table talking about peace and resolution with the action plans that they've signed on already. But all of a sudden, when this power starts and the bombs start and the killing starts, I feel like governments very well use fear to control humanity, right? I mean, you can even, I always like to bring it to individual, because personal is political, right? So, I mean, a parent can literally scare the heck out of a child with force, where that child cannot operate anymore, right? Cannot really function. Is that the right way to do it? But just to go back to saying, like, the women who were on the seat from, let's say, the Azerbaijani side, all of a sudden, I don't know, maybe it's fear of the bombs, or they see the power of their country. they're not speaking up to say, stop this, stop the bombing, let's figure out how we can resolve this. Now, I'm sure this is one example, and we can apply this to so many. And that's why I wanted to bring the Myanmar issue as well. How do we really shift the narrative as civil society to really get the attention of people to say, this is not the right way, this is not the right solution, right? I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes social media helps, you know, I think sometimes taking to the streets, like look at what Black Lives Matter is doing or was doing in the United States, it definitely is getting attention, but that it also backfires, right? So I really, honestly, at the end of the day, is it social media? Is it taking to the streets? Is it intellectual academia writing papers? Is it really going and knocking as many doors as possible through the UN system to say, please, you know, your morality, your values needs to matter, to make sure that, you know, and of course, you know, to bring in the G20 economy, you know, do you want to just like crush the economy by killing off people, either with COVID or war? Is that a solution for a good economy? I'm not an economist. Maybe it is. Maybe, you know, creating armies, we know in the past has created strong economies, but is that really the way to go? If we are that smart to create armies that creates economy, can we figure out another system that we can create, an educational system, a giving, a sharing system? You know, yeah, that sounds maybe Pollyanna-ish, but why not? Why not dream the dreams? And I'm just gonna close by saying that, again, I don't have the answer right now. I'm hoping that my other panelists will give me the answer, and I promise you I will take it to the streets with all the followers that we have with the Commission on the Status of Women, to bring the women and girls' voices into the platform to really move the needle. But I don't know what the answer is right now, but I can tell you that we are here to fight for it. And exactly what happened, like Dan said, last year, we had this whole plan with 20,000 women were coming to UN, which, by the way, is the only reason that that governments still listen to us sometimes, because we know we have the voice and the power that we can fill up those seats, right? And then, of course, COVID happened, we canceled. But guess what? We are taking advantage of this, and we are multiplying our power on a virtual platform, just like the C20. I'm learning a lot actually from C20 to bring it to the March virtual forum that we're doing on how we can move forward. So we have to believe that people's voices do matter. I mean, if we kill each other off, is it going to be like one of those science fiction movies, like the what was, oh my gosh, that I can't think of the name. It was literally in my brain. I'll put it in the chat later. But yeah, we've seen those science fiction movies where people, there's like scars, there's like a couple of hundred people left and they're fighting for water because there's no more water left in the world. That's not so far off. We knew this was happening with climate change already, right? So we have to be aware of this and remind people, educate people on what it is that we can fight for with a unified voice. I hope I didn't take too long, Dan. Thank you.
That's perfectly fine. I don't know the title of the movie, but I'm sure somebody will throw it in the chat.
Mad Max, Mad Max.
Mad Max. There you go. Wonderful. No session would be complete without a Mad Max reference. So we will now turn to Harsh for his thoughts on legitimacy and participation and the democratization of international spaces. Harsh, you have the floor.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that what options we have. You know, what is the alternative other than UN? Which gives us space, which gives us structure. There is nothing, because otherwise the other alternatives are not in that list. I was just reflecting on this issue. Say, for example, now everyone is questioning the structure of UN system, right? If you see the General Assembly also, people are asking, we need to change the structure of UN system. Like our Prime Minister said that Security Council should be bigger in the size. There is also, you know, we have experienced that during this COVID crisis, there is a basic question on the existence of WHO. The legitimacy of WHO was also asked. that how are you with this party or that party? Politicizing of the structure of such platforms is also going on. So the question today is that other than UN, we don't have any other alternative where we can have a space. So therefore, rather than civil society of the world should, I think, unite and not try to let any attempt where the UN gets weaker. Because if UN gets weaker, we also get weaker. Second issue is that, if I don't know, I might be wrong. All of you operate much closely in UN system in New York and all those. But when we read here, we read many times when we see that UN is also, they're letting, the blackmailing of UN system goes. I don't know how correct I am, but in national stage, we have seen that in many countries, UN does not have that freedom to speak against the government, because that their existence, their presence in that government depends on the goodwill of that. So this is, I think, an important issue, that how we can, as a civil society, because there's another question when you say how we can, civil society, what civil society role it can play. I think UN is one. Second is also in the other alternative structures, like even if, this G20 structure, we should also see that whatever we have gained in the last 12, 13 years, as Anselmo was saying, I think we have to maintain and strengthen our gains also, because there is also a possibility when in any structure, any system, there is no accountability, there is no secretariat, there is high possibility that civil society can go out of the radar of the governments in the future. So how to maintain the civil society remains a powerful body to represent the voice of the sector in the G20 structure is also very important. Otherwise, you see the business becoming very effective because they have the money. The think tanks are becoming very effective because I think most of the think tanks are sponsored by government and funded by government. We are the only people without money and without resources. That's what I was saying, this new system due to COVID, this online system is giving a lot of space for the voice of civil society. I think we should use in the future also. Not let, even in the post-COVID situation, even when we are allowed to travel, even we are trying to have a face-to-face conversation, I think civil society should not leave the use of social media, use of online conversations in future also. That's how we can strengthen the voice. I'll give you one example, if you give me a few minutes, that in India, we have, Vani works with this national platform, so we work with grassroots groups. And our grassroots groups were very scared of electronic systems. They were scared of, WhatsApp or Zooms and all those. But we have seen due to this COVID, since they don't get chance to meet physically, they have started using this mechanism. Now they come to Zoom meetings, and since it is in their place of comfort, they participate more actively as they used to participate in face-to-face meetings. It is much easier now for them to organize themselves Zoom meetings so that they can have conversation at their level horizontally and vertically. So I think we have to keep that spirit alive, and this voice should be articulated at global level also. And how this channel should be strengthened in future, that's how we can strengthen the voice of civil society globally and also locally in the true sense. Till now, we had more, it was more in the physical sense, but now we have got in a more actual sense, I will say, the virtual sense and actual sense. Secondly, the trust. Yes, definitely the level of trust of not only civil society, but also common people. They have more trust in UN system as compared to any other structures. We know that there is also Davos and, all the rich people, World Economic Forums and all those are there. But people, as a common citizen of any country, they trust UN system more. I think to maintain that, it is very necessary that we all play a role to strengthen that UN system, and how we can link all these floating structures with UN system so that they are accountable to someone somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Harsh. I think that's a really helpful firsthand experience of how this moment of crisis is actually creating opportunity. It's very nice to hear. So we'll turn now to Christina. And I don't know if you were planning to touch a little bit on some of the proposals that have been coming out of Stimson regarding civil society participation. But I know you've been thinking about this quite a bit. You hosted a wonderful global governance forum a couple weeks ago that allowed for many of these conversations to flourish. And I would be really interested to understand how you are thinking about this notion of participation and democratization in the context of the G20 as well as the UN. So Christina, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Dan. And I also must say that I'm so happy that I'm following Harsh, because I so much agreed with everything that he said. And I think that I'm complementing a little bit some of his really good points about civil society engagement and how civil society manages to fill the gap, particularly, for instance, in his example of how the UN is not able to stand up or to speak up more in front of governments at times. And I also want to say that, I forgot to actually give a brief introduction about myself. I'm a research associate at the Stimson Center-based think tank in Washington, DC. But my team and I in Stimson Center in itself, it's a truly global, forward-looking think tank. So, and I'm originally from Romania, so I would say that I'm very much empathize with all what the colleagues have said. So yes, I'm going to touch upon that proposal. So sorry for going into technicalities, but I'd love for everyone to hear about this. And I believe that in order to successfully represent and speak of the global citizenry through informal means and push global governance towards democratization, civil society actors must also have a formal role in decision procedures. And those roles are a little bit, not so well articulated, I would say. Their participation, therefore, must be institutionalized so that they can get formal access to decision-making arenas. Any democratization via civil society involvement, therefore, requires participation rights for non-state actors and clearly defined roles of collaboration to govern the interaction between civil society actors and international organizations. And only in this way, civil society can be acknowledged as legitimate interlocutors in political debates. In his 2020 Human Rights Report on the occasion of the UN 75th anniversary, the Secretary General Guterres recommended utilizing the UN 75 as an opportunity to launch a dialogue on a more systemic participation of civil society in UN bodies and agencies. And I quote here, to design a strategy, a system-wide strategy on civic space and adequate guidance to UN leaders in the field. Maybe not so many of you know, maybe you know, but there was a UN 75 declaration, political declaration that was officially adopted by world leaders on September 21st, this past month. And that declaration calls for the Secretary General to, and I quote here again, report back by the end of the 75th session of the General Assembly with recommendations to advance our common agenda and to respond to current and future failures. And here, seizing this opportunity, the civil society coalitions, UN 2020 and Together First, and Dan and I are very much involved, and also Anselmo with both civil society coalitions. These coalitions in participation, in partnership with key stakeholders, will seek to build upon ongoing initiatives to develop a campaign that would propose the appointment of a dedicated high-level focal point for civil society at the UN to help facilitate, implement this system-wide strategy to enhance civil society space and participation at the UN that could be featured as a recommendation in the Secretary General's UN 75 follow-up report, hopefully. And then what does this position actually entail? And I want to specifically go here and speak about three primary positive contributions that we see that this position could have. The first, it would increase the organization's limited capacity to engage proactively with civil society. The second, it would allow for the improvement of processes for civil society engagement, which vary greatly across the UN system, if everyone knows that is engaging generally, from organization to organization, country to country, and sometimes even event to event, if we are to think about all the the high-level events and the side meetings that happen with those. This should include an assessment of course, best practices, inconsistencies, and roadblocks with a view to raising standards and simplifying processes for civil society. And the third one, and the most important for us, is that this proposal, this focal point would allow the UN to hear from a broader, more diverse and representative cross-section of civil society voices by proactively seeking out through field visits and consultations their views. At present, larger and better resourced organizations, civil society organizations, particularly those based in New York and Geneva, or in country office locations, have disproportionate access, as we all know. A civil society focal point will also help the organization to prepare for the future. In the long term, one of the primary challenges that the United Nations faces is that as a state-centric institution in an increasing, it's a state-centric institution in an increasingly multipolar world. So it might struggle for relevance if it does not adapt. Governments are no longer the only or the primary actors in many areas, from tech companies in the digital sphere and multinationals with revenues exceeding the country's GDPs, to small NGOs with local knowledge needed to make an impact on social movements that can change the global conversation. The importance of actors beyond the state has been acknowledged in a number of ways over the years. Most powerfully, I would say, is in the Sustainable Development Goal 17, which is the Partnerships for Goals SDG. This importance will only grow, I believe, as we enter the decade of action to deliver the goals, and as global interconnectedness and horizontal linkages continue to erode the power of state. And I'm very much aware of the fact that I've taken a little bit of time, so I'm happy to respond to the question of legitimacy of the G20, but maybe after you give the floor to Anselmo as well, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. As always, action-packed contribution filled with practical suggestions, not just theoretical ideas. So it's always very helpful. And Selmo, perhaps the person who I turn to most for sage advice on legitimacy and participation. I would love to hear your thoughts on this specific series of questions. You have the floor, Anselmo.
Oh, thank you very much. I want to continue to the point on UN SDG relation. And Christina made in the previous round, she made a very interesting proposal to create, the G20 Secretariat. I want to make it comment on that question first, because I would support that proposal before COVID-19. Now I don't think it's anymore, because as Hashi said, we need to really strengthen the UN, because I believe, unfortunately, G20 not only losing the legitimacy and also its own effectiveness, because there are so many conflicts within G20, because G20 cannot act anymore as a unified act, because as I said before, it was economic interest, economic crisis. But now within G20 members, as I mentioned, a few countries, I don't think it will work anymore, So instead, you mentioned about 25, 40 ministers who came up with a concept. I think we need to invest more, So we need to, I would say, so instead of G20, maybe M20, or M30, middle power, moderate, supporting, upholding the multilateralism. We need to strengthening those powers, because G20 too much polarized, anymore. I have no hope, unless they have really transformed into the more positive force to address this COVID-19 and also following the economic crisis. That's my comment on this one. So in that sense, I think we need to really strengthen the UN as a more effective. And in that sense, I support your idea, creating the focal point within the UN, strengthen the civil society participation, I think I fully support that one. Also, fortunately, we have a declaration, as you kindly introduced, UN 75, and also we have a People's Declaration, People Action, I think these two can be our guiding principle for our follow-up action, because UN come up with a building back better, slogan, the recovery from the COVID-19, but it does not mean the building back to normal, back to old days, So we need to really come up with a new paradigm, new strategies. In that sense, these two declarations, UN 75 and the People Declaration can guide us. I think the C20 group, as also Huri mentioned, we are all member of UN, which is only legitimate body. Of course, it's not powerful enough, not effective, but this is not the reason that we should disengage with the UN. I think we need to put more effort on UN. In that sense, I want to make a concrete suggestions. One, SDG, still very relevant, I believe, as a policy framework to address COVID-19 and also multilateralism. This is the only policy framework agreed, among all the UN members 5 years ago, We have also tools within SDG 16 deals with the governance, peace, and also human rights, and 17, international cooperation. I think we need to strengthen really 16 and 17. For instance, maybe G20 member states, we can come up, or they can come up with their own report about performance of 16 and 17, because 16 is a very crucial to address the shrinking civic space, and also 17, as I say, international cooperation, In this sense, I think G20 countries should show more, good example, implementing SDG 16 and 17. And also we have a UPR, human rights, linking the 16 to UPR, which is a universal periodic review of human rights. That way, I believe G20 can get, the credibility back, Now credibility is very low, so we cannot invest anymore at this stage. Let's focus on these two declarations and also existing framework of SDG. And hopefully in that process, we can come up with a better solution and then better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anselmo. I think once again, having these practical suggestions combined with the changing realities of the world we're in, it's really interesting that we're always trying to grow and think about new ways to adapt to new realities. So there are a number of comments that have come in from the chat box, and I'm very grateful to those who've provided them. And I want to articulate a couple of these and then open the floor more or less to the panelists. So panelists, if you'd like to speak, just raise your hand, or you can put it in the little private Zoom chat box that we have here, and I'll turn to you. There's no order, but the questions that we've received is one about, why are we even seeking the democratization of global governance in the first place? And I think this is maybe a really interesting conceptual question to ensure that we're doing it for the right reasons or with the right ultimate intent. Another one is this idea that development is conceived in terms of the changes needed for lower income countries. But I think, and maybe we all are growing to understand, that it is in fact the high income countries that have to make the greatest amount of changes. I mean, they have to both deconstruct and reconstruct. It's not just the new construction. And that's actually a very challenging proposal to make to countries that have historically, based on the paradigms we've been using, assume that they've already achieved development. And I wonder if there are thoughts on how we can encourage deeper change, not just in those countries that have UN offices, but also in those countries that are not playing host to UN offices, though probably they should be. And then related to this is actually this notion that civil society is not monolithic. There's a tremendous diversity. So when we say civil society participation, it can't just be the participation of those who are like me, lucky enough to be in New York and have all of this access, but actually how do we ensure that the diversity of civil society is not just voiced, but is actually present? And then they not only can contribute their thoughts, but can bring the discussion back to their communities as well to help this iterative process work. So these are just a few ideas that have come up, and I would welcome more to come up, but I'll turn now to the panel to see if there are any of you who would like to take a first crack at any of those questions, but it needn't be your last intervention. So are there any thoughts on these questions, these ideas?
I'll jump right in, Dan, if you don't mind, because I think it is really important, and I've said this before, CSW is a perfect example of how we've been able to bring civil society voices into spaces that usually are not as welcoming, let's say, right? Now, while I say that, at the same time, I also say that the pushback has been very relevant and really serious too, where, you know, we work with friendly governments and we try to bring our demands or our recommendations onto the table, and then at the last minute, you know, what I'd like to call anti-science, or governments who really, for whatever reason, think that they know best and civil society should stay where they should, right? You know, and they've managed to really disrupt advancements, or, you know, developments that we've brought to the table. So I think it's really hard to say how much of an influence can civil society have, especially because, like you said, not all civil society is on the right side of history either, right? So there's a lot of disruption amongst civil society themselves, and that's unfortunate, but we have to deal with that regularly when we're trying to influence. But at the same time, I feel like our voices have to keep coming up no matter where or how. And I think there was a comment about, if one of the strongest countries in the world is trying to remove themselves from this multilateral spaces, what do we do? And that's heartbreaking to think. You know, I live in a country that I'm not very proud of right now, in the United States, and we're doing the best we can to vote out a government that is aiming to isolate itself and just be narcissist, if you want to call it that. And that's not how it works, because we're influenced. No matter how strong this country might be, we're influenced with what's going on around the world. Our people are engaged with around the world. So I think, you know, there's always going to be a challenge, but our goal is to, for example, in this case, we'd like to vote our government out in November. And how do we go about this? And, you know, we're doing our own activism on the ground here. But I also liked what, Anselmo said about that it's not only about the strong governments, right? There's always the middle, and even the little engine that could governments, the little governments that are really trying their best to bring humanity, human rights, and development. They can be excellent examples for us to follow on how to translate that into a larger scale, scale it up, as we call it at the UN. So yes, thank you for that opportunity to address that.
Thank you. We'll go with Harsh, then Anselmo. I know everybody really wants to go for it. I'm so sorry. Harsh, go ahead, then Anselmo.
Yeah, I'll not take much of time. I just wanted to reflect upon the state of civil society itself. Because see, it's always, when you compare the voice of civil society, it's not monolithic, but if you see globally, if you analyze for the last almost 2 decades or so, there has been a systematic approach by most of the countries in the world to weaken the civil society. Economically, space-wise, the laws have been created, imposed on them, which make their life difficult, even getting funds and resources, not from across the border, even from within the country itself. There is also a question that how the negative picture is projected about the civil society in the media and the general public. So narrative is also against us. The space is shrinking. Now, I think and the last also important point is that the sector itself is divided. We are divided thematically. We are divided strategically. Someone says that we are service delivery. Someone says we are intermediary. Someone says that we are research and advocacy. Everyone is happy in their own silos. So we don't have, even our own voices not say, unite. We have different voices which coming out. It's like what you call in cuckoo-phony, what the word they use in English. But the second issue, which is more important today, is that the voice of grassroots, whether it reaches up to those international forums and platforms or not, that is also a question of consideration. And now what COVID has done, in fact, interestingly, they have expose these fault lines within the UN CSO's weakness, CSO's status in each country and globally also. When the crisis comes in such a global level that starting from grassroots to internationally, we have to save lots of people. Then you came out to see that's how civil society is going to respond without resources, without space, and they have weakened for the last 2 decades. But civil society is doing their best to come to that level. So if you see the last I think 6 months or so, there has been narrative which has been changing in the public's mind about the civil society. The contribution of civil society has been highlighted in the media. It has been now recognized by the government, who otherwise was always against the civil society. I think we have to also understand that this crisis which we are going through is also a learning chapter for the civil society, that how they should behave in future if something happens, how they can learn from this and be stronger to respond to that situation, how they can change the narrative not only at local level but globally about the civil society, which has been negative generalization which has also been there. So I think that is also, and also space, how to be now. See, now the realization is that no single stakeholder, whether it's a government or it's a private sector or even civil society, can handle a crisis of that level, a COVID level, a global pandemic. All are working together. How we can take it, in future, this thing forward and take this learning that if to rebuild the world after post-COVID, we need to work together again. I think that is also another learning which we should keep in our mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh. And Selma.
Okay, there was one question you read, how or why we need democratized global governance, and also your question was how can global governance be democratized? I want to take up that issue once again, because from my point of view, global governance means basically UN is composed of the government, state, and also we have a civil society, we have a private sector. But now problem is in many countries we see the sliding back, or shrinking civic space, which means shrinking democracy, in many countries, even including, say, the United States, and also some Western countries, So I think we need to start again, with the national democratization, because there is also a way to, the global governance, because otherwise, for instance, the financial crisis 2008 started from United States. It spilled over all country, the Africa, many developing countries, they are not responsible, but they are most affected, Again, this coronavirus, it started from the China. Of course, this is a very controversial, but it's become the whole global crisis, So that means the national government, without proper effective national governance, we cannot really talk about the global governance, So in that sense, I want to stress once again, good, effective national governance, or democratic governance, or democracy, or democratization even in the country. That's number one. Number two, I think also while we are strengthening civil society participation, we need to also give more space for parliamentarian. There's a campaign, the UN Parliamentary Assembly, together with the General Assembly, represented by the executive government. We need to strengthen the voice of parliament, provided they are all democratically elected, provided they are representing people's voice, I think that's one. While we are strengthening civil society and also parliamentary assembly, including local, not only national, local parliamentarian. That way, they are our allies, So I think we need to have a really long-term strategies. And you remember, UN was created after World War II, right? And G20 was created 2018 as a meeting of the ministers. Oh, no, 1997. But now 2018, economic crisis, So now we have another crisis, COVID-19, So what we need, So we need to have a restructuring the global governance. Now we need, that's why I suggested, we need to strengthen not only civil society, but also parliamentarian and also many other the institution, local government, local government. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anselmo. Christina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dan, and I'm actually very happy to follow Anselmo because I was going to answer the question about why global governance needs to be democratized in the same way, but And let me just also add, you know, on top of what you've already said, Anselmo, that I believe that we've definitely seen a rise of raising nationalism, and we've definitely seen a shrinking civil society space. And a lot of times what happens, and then corruption comes into place as well, and that's when things get worse, right? We're seeing the cases such as the one in Ukraine, where political leaders might not be fairly elected, or their election might not have been fair. So then what do we do in these instances? Do we really want these leaders? Are these leaders the ones that are actually supposed to represent us in these international organizations? Are those the ones that are actually going to make civil society, to make the citizens' voices heard in these international settings? So I think that what civil society manages to do is to primarily promote these core democratic qualities, such as participation, inclusion, deliberation, transparency, and they are the ones that are mostly doing the work on the ground. So they are the ones most closely connected with the citizens. So in that regard, I mean, it will be quite you know, reverse thinking to think that international organizations can speak, and I know that, you know, that has been done for a while, but can speak for the people without actually knowing from them directly. And civil society is able to fill this space. Now, I would like to also respond very briefly to the question related to what opportunities can be found in areas where G20 countries should lead by example in making changes in their own behavior, especially when it comes to sustainable consumption and production. So what I thought immediately when I saw this question was precisely to the food crisis that the COVID pandemic has, you know, managed to highlight this past few months, and the fact that there is still high consumption in all these rich and developed countries, while the emerging and middle and developing economies with large number of poor people and income losses from disruption of economic activity have increased food insecurity. So there is a balancing act that needs to be done, and I think that will be done only by simply educating the public. And that starts, of course, with educating our children. And also, I think in terms of education, I think it's also very important to think of adopting healthy diets, for instance, that are actually projected to lead to a reduction, if I'm not mistaken, of 97% in direct and indirect health costs. So, and then also in terms of the social costs that it will have and the impact it will have on greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to also think about that. And some of the countries that produce the most and consume the most are rich countries. So yes, I think it's our responsibility as citizens first, but it's also, of course, educating our populations.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask each of you to take 1 minute. I'm going to be sharp about this. Pretend like you're in an elevator with a G20 leader, and you have to, and he says, probably he, unfortunately, he says, what is it that you think we should do today? Or what do you think is the process that we should begin today? And you have 30 seconds to respond to that question. And you didn't expect to be in there with him, just like you didn't expect this question. What do you say? So Anselmo, you are unmuted. So I'm going to turn to you first.
Oh, I will pass our declaration, People's Declaration 75 and action plan. Please read before you sleep.
That's a fantastic answer. And somebody should hopefully paste a link to that in the chat box. I'm looking at you, Richard, if you're still on the call. I'll also try to put a link to that in the chat box. What would others say to that individual?
The only thing which I feel is that, putting people first. We have seen for the last so many decades that they have put government first, or sometimes the rulers first, or capitalist first. Let this time put the people first.
Huri?
Yes, actually something similar to that. I was going to say, you stepped up, you took this responsibility. You're part of this powerful G20. Take action, deliver on your promises. You know, enough of this, like, you know, it's not just about the label. It's not just about the power. Take action now and deliver on your promises.
Fantastic. And Christina, final word.
And I think that what I would say is to not necessarily have expectations and think that because there's a power vacuum in the current system, that cannot be filled by you. And that goes for countries, right? It goes for individuals. When you think that you're not sufficiently good enough, or you can have a sufficiently good presence to take action. But I think that, and I would not say that to only one, right? I would say that to one so that he or she can take action and can motivate the others around. And I think, you know, the Alliance for Multilateralism was able to do this, but we're not seeing them in action as much as we should. Especially we don't see them in action in terms of collaborating with civil society. So we want to see more of that. So that's what I would tell them.
Thank you so much. Those are some great answers. I'm going to try my best to wrap up a little bit of what we heard today. I think it was a wonderful conversation with fantastic ideas. Somebody has asked in the chat box whether this will be made available, this video will be made available. I can only hope that the answer is yes, because I need to go back and take notes of what you actually said. I've been so busy being entertained by you that I haven't taken the appropriate notes. But in terms of closing remarks, just a couple of thoughts to summarize. The first is just to say that the idealist used to be the person who thought about global cooperation. We now know that that's actually more the realist perspective. The realist used to think that everything is about money and state sovereignty, realpolitik. So while the states do still have primary influence, it is actually idealistic to think it can stay this way, and realist to recognize the necessity of global cooperation. And I think that's just a reframing that we have to perhaps take ownership of. And we are, in that sense, in a real privileged moment in history where we can set the precedents for what universal participation looks like in ways that have never before been dreamed of. And this isn't something that we can solely rely upon our governments to do. As Harsh was saying earlier, this is for us. This is for every individual, the people, to take action on. And I'm very excited about platforms like this and the hundreds or thousands of others that are arising. Another thought that arose today is this idea that representation is on all of us. I happen to be an able-bodied, middle-class male living in the United States, which one could assume means that I can only speak from this perspective. But in fact, I have a duty to do my best to understand the needs of others and ensure that their voice can somehow be present. So whether that's stepping back or learning or really listening and then taking those views, because I do have a privileged position and it means that I have to use it. And in fact, all of us in some sense have our own privileges and we have to use them for good, of course. Then this idea that came up in the chat box and I think is very helpful just to surface is that the relationship between the local, national, and global needs to be constantly considered and reconsidered. And that the strengthening of one can lead to the strengthening of the other. It's not that we are preferring global over national, but we are actually talking about global to enhance national. And likewise with national and local and all of these things. It's actually a mutual reinforcement that we're looking for. And the strengthening of one can support the strengthening of all. Now, the last idea that came to my mind is that we've touched on 4 different levels of change. And I think these are all important and we should recognize what we're speaking to when we're speaking. So to me, the most superficial level is that of individuals. And we've talked about, you know, who are the people who are in these decision-making positions and what needs to change about them or about their approaches and how can we support that. The second is about the structures. What are the rules of the game? And how can we perhaps modify those rules that allow for a better system? But then we have to figure out the narratives. What are the narratives that we've told ourselves? Like competition is the way to get the best results, more so than cooperation. These narratives actually determine the structures. But then what determines those societal narratives are the values that we hold so dear. And as we are exploring a revisiting of our values, we can then question the narratives, create better structures, which then would actually allow for the better kind of people that we want to see, to feel empowered in these positions and actually take their proper place there. And I think as we're talking about change at all of these levels, we can really see a strengthening of the multilateral system. And each of these things must continue to be explored. This is just one of many conversations that should be ongoing. And in fact, my office, and I'm sure that many others, are continuing these conversations. I would encourage you to get engaged with the NGO CSW, to reach out to Anselmo, who has more networks than a phone book, to talk to Christina about what Stimson is doing in their constant thinking. Harsh has some of the best grassroots stories and access of anyone I know. And I would encourage you all to find ways to meet with these people in the future. And I have also put in the chat box my contact information if you're interested, and we can continue the conversation together, because this is an ongoing process. It has been for millennia. It will continue to be for more millennia, and we must do our part, as every generation must. So thank you once again to each of the speakers for their valuable contributions, and I look forward to our continued collaboration. Take care.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for being
Have a
here.
good day, Christina, Huri, Harsh.